Adaptations of popular or critically acclaimed literary works are nothing new and have long formed the backbone of cinema. Look into enough movies or TV shows, and you might be surprised just how many of them are based on a novel or a series of books. And over the decades, as the film industry has grown into a multi-billion-dollar venture, so too has its hunger for obtaining the rights and adapting the next big book series for audiences to go crazy over. And right now, one of the most popular adaptations of a book series is HBO's Game of Thrones. Based on A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin and adapted by showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, what once started as a modestly successful show in its first season has since ballooned into a pop culture phenomenon. People just can't get enough of the richly detailed and believable fantasy world and the nuanced characters that inhabit it. For 7 seasons, it has thrilled viewers with its complex narrative and massive scale. Each season, it continues to push the envelope of what can be accomplished within the limitations of its medium, further blurring the lines between television and film. The show is all the more special because for the most part it has remained faithful to the author's vision, an impressive feat when you take into consideration the intricacies of the source material. Martin has famously said that he wrote A Song of Ice and Fire to be unfilmable, a response to the creative compromises he experienced writing for television. It was purposely written to be unrestrained, big and complicated and epic in scope in a way television or even film can't be. This makes it all the more delightfully ironic then that the show has done such a remarkable job adapting Martin's vision to the small screen, especially in its early seasons when it was practically a scene-for-scene retelling. Of course there were compromises, but the stuff that mattered remained intact thanks to inspired casting, a dedication to filming in real-world locations, and a reverence to the books with which it was based, all of which demonstrated an earnest attempt to bring Martin's compulsive story to life on the small screen. For it to be as successful as it is one of the modern miracles of television. However, as the series went on, it did start to diverge from the books, simplifying or even omitting certain storylines while extending others. While some of the changes were welcomed, others were controversial to say the least, and as a result the series began to be met with a bit more contention than it used to be, especially from purists who didn't like to see Martin's story changed so drastically. Yet despite so many changes, Game of Thrones could still be said to be one of the more faithful adaptations of its kind ever made, as it still hit the same major plot points and followed the overarching story of the books. But with the conclusion of season 5, the show found itself in a unique position. It had run out of material to adapt. At this point, Martin had only finished 5 out of his planned 7 books in the series, the last being A Dance with Dragons, most of the material of which was adapted in season 5. Suddenly, Game of Thrones found itself in the uncomfortable position of forging ahead without the skeleton of Martin's narrative to support itself. Frankly, this is an unprecedented scenario, at least as far as adaptations are concerned. Other popular series like Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings all had the luxury of having a completed book series to fall back on. Following season 5, Game of Thrones had no such luxury, putting the showrunners in the difficult predicament of writing almost wholly original material for a series that once prided itself on being a faithful adaptation. This was both exciting and terrifying, as now no one really knew what to expect. For the first time, readers of the books were almost as much in the dark as the average viewer, which gave the show an extra sense of unpredictability. On the other hand, it wasn't clear how well Benioff and Weiss would do without the guiding hand of Martin, who without question is a far more talented writer and is the heart of what makes Game of Thrones such a compelling story. Season 6 and beyond was a new era for the show, an era where it was further divorced from the author to a far greater extent than it ever had been before. And it would be dishonest not to admit that the absence of Martin has had a negative impact on the final seasons. Contrary to what many might say, Benioff and Weiss are not terrible writers, but there's no denying that they lack the fine-tuning and attention to detail that makes Martin's writing so good. While the duo's ability to streamline does give the story a greater sense of forward momentum than Martin's books, which tend to get bogged down in the particulars as he attempts to juggle the increasingly out-of-control narratives, their writing can be quite sloppy, which has a detrimental effect on the methodical plotting that Game of Thrones has long been known for. To compensate, the show has increasingly grown to rely more on sheer spectacle to tell its story than ever before. Gone are the days of skipping a battle due to lack of funding. Since season 4, the show has focused more on crafting action beats to move the plot forward and develop characters. While this undeniably gives certain scenes a more visceral quality, it also leads to less inspired storytelling methods. A great example of this can be seen in the resolution of Arya's training with the Faceless Men in season 6. A storyline of morbid intrigue and mystery devolves into a fairly standard chase sequence that breaks the believability and sense of realism that defines the world. The scene wasn't written to necessarily make sense, but more so because the showrunners probably felt that an action scene was the only way to satisfyingly resolve the storyline. Part of me thinks that this greater focus on spectacle over for logic and detail is part of the reason why Game of Thrones has grown so much in popularity. Later seasons have a much more conventional way of telling their story than earlier seasons. Less focus is given to complex politicking and storylines are whittled down into action set pieces. Given this, it is totally understandable why passionate fans of the novels would feel dissatisfied with the way Game of Thrones has developed. While the books have action scenes, they make up a fraction of the material. Most of the focus is on character and world building, and whenever the show decides to film an action scene, it eschews this more nuanced method of telling the story in favor of a more blockbuster, mainstream mentality. Nonetheless, there is a practical reason for this greater focus on action. The reality is that through prose, novels have the advantage of being able to instantly transport a reader into the headspace of the characters, allowing for a deeper connection and understanding. The show, however, cannot do this, at least not without heavy voiceover work, which, let's face it, would be terrible. Action, however, is a tool specific to the art of film, utilizing visuals through stunt performing to tell a story. It is an advantage film has over books, and so you can't blame the showrunners for employing this tool to show instead of tell. This is why we get show-only storylines like the Night's Watch Mutineers in Season 4 or the Massacre of Hardhome in Season 5. Both plotlines are a way of showing off Jon Snow's skills as a swordsman and his evolution into a leadership role. They take the inner growth and struggles within Jon Snow that a reader of the books is intimate with and translates it into a thrilling visual ballet. In the case of Hardhome, it also births new life into the White Walker storyline, giving it a much more needed sense of dread and foreboding that at this same point the books don't have. In both cases, it's not perfect, but such developments arguably might be the best adaptation decision they could make. And for better or worse, these decisions become more abundant as the series goes on, taking complete control after the 5th season when it no longer has any novels to adapt. Suddenly, the slow, methodical pace of the previous seasons is replaced with a more streamlined effort to get things moving, which has its advantages and disadvantages. While it's cathartic to finally see things coming to a head, it also has a whiplash effect. This is especially the case in Season 7, which speeds along at a breakneck pace compared to earlier seasons. This is a result of the continued focus on epic action, which takes more time and money to film, hence why there were only 7 episodes. And to be fair, the set pieces in Game of Thrones continue to impress. Both Daenerys' attack on the Lannister army and the Frozen Lake battle rival most of what had been seen on the big screen last year, and most importantly, fulfill many of the narrative promises made in the first season. And it could be argued that the faster pace is necessary to give the final chapter a greater sense of urgency, since you can't deny that any more time spent casually traipsing around Westeros would kill the momentum. This, however, doesn't excuse the increasing use of narrative shortcuts to move the plot forward, and cheap sleight of hand to keep the audience guessing, which leads to certain characters making baffling decisions that could be avoided with some simple communication. It's the showrunner's attempts to give the show some suspense, but that's not possible when the audience is too busy questioning the actions of the characters. Now, with that being said, I certainly don't envy the showrunners and am sympathetic to the situation they are in. They've basically been forced to write themselves out of the knot that Martin tied them into, which is something even he continues to have an incredibly hard time doing despite having far more time to do so. Somehow they have to figure out a way to bring characters and storylines together that have been separate for so long in a way that makes sense and delivers on all the setup that came before, all under the demands of an astonishingly fast production schedule. While that doesn't necessarily excuse some of the baffling narrative decisions they make, it does at least explain them. Making a television show is different than writing a book. It's a much more collaborative effort that has more limitations and thus requires different sacrifices. I think at this point, to maximize one's enjoyment, it's important to view Game of Thrones as its own work of cinematic art, and in this way it continues to excel in the areas of filmmaking that matter. The acting, the costumes, the set design, the cinematography, and musical score all work to tell the story in a way that the books can't. There are some truly emotionally evocative and spine-chilling sequences that don't come from the books. The Season 6 finale alone contains 2 such sequences, the reveal of Jon Snow's real parentage and the destruction of the Sept of Baelor. Both take advantage of the medium, telling the story in a way only film can, using visuals, sound design, and editing to evoke emotion within the audience. In these moments, it doesn't matter if it's adapted faithfully from the novels. When it works, it works. And now, with the upcoming 8th and final season, Game of Thrones will be coming to a close, concluding the story that Martin began decades ago before he does. This is a very unfortunate situation for George Martin and for those who love his books. To see his creation resolve in another medium without his involvement feels wrong, at least from an artistic perspective. But at the same time, there is no one to blame but Martin himself. Despite his promises, he couldn't finish even one book before the show aired in its entirety. Some have even given up the hope that the books will ever be finished, potentially potentially making Game of Thrones the only ending we'll ever get. This begs the question then, just how close to Martin's vision for the ending will the show's ending be? Benioff and Weiss have stated numerous times that they have spoken to Martin at length about the ending, and Martin himself has stated that he has always known the fates of the primary characters. However, he has also stated that he doesn't plan his story out ahead of time, and that he allows it to grow spontaneously as he writes. From this, I think it's safe to assume that while the major plot points will remain the same, the path to and around those points will be wholly different. And if and when the rest of the books are released, aside from the sheer excitement of once again seeing the story told from the master himself, it will be fascinating to see how different or similar it will be to the TV series, which goes to show just how unique this book series and its adaptation are compared to others. I honestly can't think of another adaptation that's as similar as it is different to its source material like Game of Thrones is. It's a show that started out as one of the most faithful adaptations of its kind, only to slowly transform into its own thing, George's world as seen through the lens of David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. It's an adaptation of a series of epic fantasy novels that will conclude the story before the novels do, a situation that's as exciting in its possibilities as it is unsettling in its implications. Regardless of whether or not the show delivers a satisfying ending or if the next book ever comes out, there's no denying that Game of Thrones has been a watershed TV show, not just for what it has achieved within the landscape of television both creatively and technically, but also for the intriguing questions and conversations it inspires regarding the relationship between author and adaptation. Enjoy it while it lasts. We may never see its like again.